The scorching Arizona sun cast long shadows across Prescott's dusty Main Street as Federal Marshal Ethan Mitchell dismounted his horse, boots crunching on sun-baked earth. 3 weeks of tracking mysterious murders had led him to this remote mining settlement, where prospectors' dreams of striking it rich mingled with the acrid smell of gunpowder and fear. His weathered face bore the marks of 20 years enforcing law in the harshest territories. But something about these killings felt different, calculated, precise, and disturbingly methodical. Running his fingers along the telegram in his pocket, Ethan recalled the details that had drawn him here. 5 dead miners in 3 months, each one having recently struck gold. The local sheriff, Benjamin Turner, had requested federal assistance after the latest victim was found with his throat cut and his claim papers missing. But what troubled Ethan most wasn't the violence. It was the pattern. Every victim had been found exactly 3 days after reporting their strike at the assayer's office. The Golden Nugget Saloon's batwing doors creaked as Ethan pushed through them, the relative darkness inside a welcome respite from the merciless sun. Helen Phillips, the owner's daughter, looked up from wiping down the bar, her eyes narrowing at the sight of his badge. She was young, maybe 25, with a sharp intelligence in her gaze that suggested she saw more than most in this town of desperate men and broken dreams. "Marshal Mitchell," she said, setting aside her rag. "We've been expecting you. Father said you'd likely show up after what happened to poor Jacob Roberts." Her voice carried a hint of something beyond mere concern. Fear, perhaps, or knowledge she wasn't ready to share. Ethan noted how her hands trembled slightly as she poured him a glass of water, though her face remained carefully composed. The saloon's other patrons maintained a conspicuous silence, their conversations dying to whispers as Ethan settled onto a bar stool. Through the grimy windows, he could see the imposing structure of the Prescott Mining Company's main office, where Alexander Phillips, Helen's father and the region's most powerful mine owner, conducted his business. The building cast a long shadow over the town, both literally and figuratively. "Tell me about Jacob Roberts," Ethan said quietly, watching Helen's reflection in the mirror behind the bar. "Word is he found a rich vein 2 weeks before his death." Helen's eyes flickered briefly to a table in the corner, where Noah Turner, the sheriff's younger brother, sat nursing a whiskey. The exchange wasn't lost on Ethan, who'd learned long ago that the smallest gestures often revealed the largest secrets. "Jacob was a good man," Helen replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Simple prospector who'd worked these hills for 15 years without luck. Then last month he burst in here celebrating, buying drinks for everyone. Said he'd finally found his fortune." She paused, glancing again at Noah Turner. 3 days later, they found him in his cabin, throat cut ear to ear. The afternoon heat pressed against the saloon's windows as Ethan absorbed this information. Outside, a group of miners trudged past, their faces covered in dust and disappointment. Among them walked Frances Turner, the sheriff's wife, carrying supplies from the general store. She stopped briefly, looking through the saloon window, her expression unreadable before hurrying on. Ethan had investigated dozens of mining town murders over the years, but something about this case pulled at him like a splinter under the skin. His father had been a miner, working claims across the territory until a cave-in claimed his life when Ethan was just 16. The familiar scent of mineral dust and broken earth brought those memories flooding back, along with the fierce desire to protect those who worked the mines from those who would exploit them. As the day wore on, more pieces of the puzzle emerged through careful conversation. Clara Perez, the assayer's widow, who now ran the office, mentioned that Alexander Phillips had been unusually interested in recent claim registrations. And Alice Roberts, Jacob's sister, spoke of strange men watching her brother's cabin in the days before his death. Each detail added to a picture that grew darker by the hour. When Sheriff Benjamin Turner finally appeared at the saloon's entrance, his face was grave. "Marshal," he said, "we've got another one. Miner named Martinez, found in his claim shaft. Same as the others." Ethan stood, noting how Helen's face had gone pale at the news. Outside, the setting sun painted the sky blood red, a fitting backdrop for what was becoming clear. This wasn't just about random killings. Something far more sinister was taking root in Prescott's blood-soaked soil. Ethan followed Sheriff Benjamin through the darkening streets of Prescott, their boots kicking up dust that seemed to glow crimson in the last rays of sunlight. The mine shaft where Martinez's body lay was on the outskirts of town, past the assayer's office where Clara's lamp still burned in the window. The marshal couldn't shake the feeling that her earlier words about Alexander Phillips held more weight than he'd initially realized. The shaft entrance gaped like an open wound in the mountainside, the wooden support beams casting long shadows across the ground. Two deputies stood guard, their lanterns creating dancing patterns on the rocky walls. The body lay crumpled near a pickaxe, positioned in a way that might have suggested an accident to less experienced eyes. But Ethan had seen enough of these scenes to know better. "Notice anything different about this one, Sheriff?" Ethan asked, crouching beside the body. Martinez's hands were calloused from years of mining, but there was something else, a scrap of paper clutched in his rigid fingers. Benjamin held his lantern closer as Ethan carefully extracted the document. It was a claim registration form, partially filled out, with coordinates that made the marshal's eyes narrow. The coordinates matched a section of the mine that Alexander Phillips had declared played out months ago. Yet, Martinez had apparently found something worth documenting, something worth dying for. Ethan tucked the paper into his vest pocket, his mind racing back to Helen's worried expression at the saloon. She'd mentioned Phillips had been pushing to buy up seemingly worthless claims lately. As they emerged from the shaft, a figure darted between the buildings, too quick to identify but deliberate in its movements. Benjamin drew his revolver, but Ethan stayed his hand. "Let them think we didn't see," he muttered. "I want to know where our shadow leads us." The sheriff nodded, understanding dawning in his weathered features. Back in town, Ethan made a show of heading toward his room at the boarding house, but slipped out the back instead. The desert night had turned cold, stars pricking through the velvet sky as he made his way to Clara's office. She was still there, as he'd hoped, poring over ledgers by lamplight. When she saw him at the door, her face showed no surprise. "I've been expecting you, Marshal," Clara said, pulling out a stack of papers from a locked drawer. "After what happened to Martinez, I knew you'd come asking about these." The documents were claim registrations spanning the past 6 months, all for parcels Phillips had deemed worthless, all purchased for a fraction of their potential value. But what caught Ethan's eye was the pattern they formed when mapped together. "They're all connected," he breathed, seeing it now. "Underground seams don't follow property lines." Phillips knew. He must have found something big enough to... He trailed off as Clara nodded grimly. "Big enough to change everything," she finished. "The kind of strike that could bring thousands here, destabilize the whole territory. Jacob figured it out first, that's why he died. Martinez must have found the same vein." A floorboard creaked behind them, and Ethan spun, drawing his revolver in one fluid motion. Frances, the young telegrapher, stood in the doorway, her face ashen. "Marshal," she whispered. "Alexander Phillips just sent a wire to some men in Globe. They're coming tonight." Her hands trembled as she held out the telegram copy. "And sir," I recognized one of the names. "He's the same man who was in town the night Jacob Roberts died." The pieces were falling into place faster now, but time was running short. Ethan could feel it slipping away like sand through his fingers. Outside, the wind had picked up, carrying the scent of sage and something else. Something metallic, like the copper taste of blood on the horizon. Tomorrow would bring more than just dawn to Prescott. It would bring a reckoning. Ethan folded the telegram carefully, his weathered fingers pressing each crease with deliberate precision. The paper's edges were damp with Frances's nervous sweat, but the message was clear enough. 4 men were riding from Globe, hired guns who'd leave nothing but silence in their wake. He glanced at the young telegrapher, noting how she twisted her apron between trembling fingers. "Frances, I need you to do something for me. Find Helen at the boarding house and tell her to gather any miners' widows still in town. Have them meet at the church basement." The autumn wind rattled the office windows as Ethan checked his Winchester, methodically counting cartridges. Alexander Phillips had built his empire on borrowed time and stolen lives, each golden nugget paid for in blood. The mine owner's scheme was elegant in its simplicity. Let the prospectors do the work, then silence them when they struck it rich. The massive vein they'd found would bring too many eyes, too many questions. Phillips couldn't allow that. Outside, Prescott's main street lay quiet under the fading light. A few oil lamps flickered in windows, and somewhere a dog barked at unseen shadows. Ethan's boots kicked up dust as he crossed to the livery stable where Benjamin, the old stablemaster, was already saddling his gray mare. Figured you'd be needin' her soon, the old man muttered, his roomy eyes sharp with understanding. Heard tell of riders coming up from the south. Bad business, that. The mare's flanks were warm beneath Ethan's palm as he led her out into the gathering dusk. Marshal Ethan Mitchell wiped sweat from his brow as he studied the blood-soaked scene before him. The body of Benjamin Turner lay sprawled in his tent, gold dust scattered across the rough wooden floor like fallen stars. This marked the fourth murder in Globe's mining district in as many weeks, and like the others, Turner had recently struck it rich in the Phillips Mining Company's claims. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. The desert wind howled through canvas walls as Ethan knelt to examine Turner's belongings. A worn leather journal caught his eye, its pages filled with careful notes about mineral deposits and promising veins. Turner had been methodical in his prospecting, marking locations with precise coordinates. One entry from 3 days prior stood out. Turner had discovered something significant enough that he'd torn out the following pages, leaving only ragged edges behind. Helen Roberts, the local assayer's widow, appeared in the tent's entrance, her face drawn with concern. She'd been helping Ethan piece together connections between the victims, having known them all through her late husband's business. "Marshal, you need to see this," she said, holding out a crumpled telegram. The message was brief but telling. Turner had been planning to sell his claim and leave Globe, just like the other 3 victims had intended. The afternoon sun cast long shadows as Ethan rode toward the Phillips Mining Company office, where Alexander Phillips himself sat behind an imposing mahogany desk. The mine owner's carefully groomed appearance seemed at odds with the frontier town's rugged character. "Tragic business with Turner," Phillips remarked smoothly, though his eyes remained cold. "These claim jumpers and bandits are becoming quite troublesome." Back at his office, Ethan spread out a map marked with the murder locations. Helen helped him cross-reference dates and details while her daughter Clara served coffee. The girl had her mother's sharp mind, and it was she who noticed that all 4 victims had been working claims along the same ridgeline. "It's like they were following something," Clara mused, tracing the pattern with her finger. Francis Perez, owner of the local general store, provided another crucial piece of information. She remembered Turner arguing with Noah Phillips, Alexander's brother and the mine's foreman, just days before his death. Turner was shouting about being cheated, she recalled. Said he'd found something that would change everything. Noah told him to keep quiet if he knew what was good for him. The deeper Ethan dug, the more he uncovered about the Phillips family's grip on Globe. Their father had founded the town 20 years earlier, but it was Alexander who had transformed it into a profitable mining operation. The family controlled everything from water rights to supply contracts, and their influence reached as far as Prescott's territorial offices. Anna Turner, Benjamin's sister, arrived from Flagstaff with questions about her brother's death. She brought with her a letter he'd sent just before his murder, speaking of an unprecedented discovery. "He wrote that he'd found enough gold to make the strikes in Yuma look like pebbles," she told Ethan, her voice trembling. But he was afraid someone would stop him from filing his claim. As evening approached, Ethan noticed Jacob Mitchell, his estranged cousin and the mine's chief engineer, leaving the Phillips office in a hurry. The man's usual confident stride was replaced by nervous glances over his shoulder. When Ethan tried to approach him, Jacob quickened his pace, disappearing down a side street. The marshal knew his cousin. Something had rattled him badly. Helen's research into the assay office records revealed a disturbing pattern. Official reports showed declining gold yields across all claims, yet the Phillips Mining Company's profits had never been higher. The numbers didn't add up, suggesting someone was manipulating the records to hide the true extent of the area's gold deposits. The marshal spent hours questioning miners in Globe's crowded saloon, where whiskey loosened tongues and old grievances surfaced. Stories emerged of claim boundaries mysteriously shifting, of rich strikes suddenly turning barren overnight, and of men who asked too many questions finding themselves driven out of town. Or worse. The Phillips brothers' names came up repeatedly, always in whispers. Each victim had made their discovery within days of their death, yet no gold was ever found with their bodies. Ethan suspected the murders weren't about robbery, but about keeping something hidden, something that could shatter the Phillips family's control over Globe's mining operations. As he pondered this, a shot rang out in the darkness and the window behind him exploded in a shower of glass. Ethan dove behind the heavy oak bar as more shots splintered the saloon's wooden walls. the acrid smell of gunpowder mixed with spilled whiskey as patrons scrambled for cover. Through the chaos, he caught a glimpse of two riders disappearing into the moonlit desert, their horses' hooves kicking up clouds of dust that glowed silver in the night air. The attack confirmed he was getting close to the truth. As he helped the shaken bartender sweep up broken glass the next morning, Ethan learned that Benjamin Phillips, the younger of the mining company's owners, had been seen earlier that day in an intense argument with his brother Alexander outside the assay office. The brothers rarely disagreed publicly, making the incident noteworthy among the town's gossips. Deciding to follow this lead, Ethan made his way to the assay office where Francis, the elderly clerk who'd worked there for decades, reluctantly shared that Benjamin had been bringing in unusually rich ore samples late at night, requesting private assessments away from prying eyes. The samples came from a section of the mine that was supposedly played out months ago. The deeper Ethan dug, the more he discovered about the Phillips family's iron grip on Globe. Alexander controlled the mining claims office, while Benjamin managed day-to-day operations. Their sister Helen ran the town's only bank, which held the mortgages on most local businesses. It was a carefully constructed web of power, but Ethan sensed growing tension between the siblings. At the undertaker's, Noah, a young assistant who'd prepared the latest victim's body, revealed something the official report had omitted: traces of a distinctive red clay on the dead man's boots. This clay was only found in one part of the territory, near an abandoned claim the Phillips family had written off as worthless years ago. When Ethan rode out to investigate the abandoned claim at dawn, he found fresh horse tracks leading to a concealed entrance. Inside, recent tool marks scored the walls, and a rich vein of gold-bearing quartz glinted in his lantern light. This wasn't just another strike. The size of the deposit could rival the biggest discoveries in California. The sound of approaching horses sent Ethan deeper into the tunnel. Hidden behind a support beam, he overheard Benjamin and Alexander in a heated exchange. Benjamin wanted to develop the claim openly, arguing they had enough power to control its impact. Alexander insisted the discovery would bring too many outsiders, destroying everything their father had built. When Benjamin threatened to expose the murders, Alexander's response was chilling. "Then you'll join them, brother." Making his way back to Globe, Ethan found an unexpected ally in Clara, the Phillips' estranged cousin who managed the town's telegraph office. She shared decades of coded messages between the brothers, suggesting a pattern of violence going back to their father's day. The family's wealth wasn't built on luck or business acumen, but on systematic elimination of anyone who threatened their control. The pieces were falling into place, but Ethan knew he needed more than circumstantial evidence. The killer was clearly Alexander Phillips, but proving it would require catching him in the act. With Clara's help, Ethan arranged for a rumor to spread about a rich strike in the northern claims. If the pattern held, Alexander wouldn't be able to resist eliminating another threat to his empire. As dusk settled over the desert, Ethan positioned himself near the claims office, watching Alexander's movements through the gathering darkness. The town's fate hung in the balance. Exposing the truth would shatter the Phillips family's control, but the alternative was allowing a murderer to continue his brutal reign over Globe's future. The real question was, how many more would die before justice could be served? The desert wind carried whispers of gold through Globe's streets as Ethan watched Alexander Phillips make his way toward the claims office. The townsfolk had eagerly spread the rumor of the northern strike, their eyes gleaming with the familiar fever that accompanied such news. But beneath their excitement lay an undercurrent of fear. Too many prospectors had vanished after similar discoveries, their bodies found broken at the bottom of mine shafts or lost forever to the merciless desert. Clara had positioned herself strategically at the saloon, maintaining her cover as a sympathetic ear to the miners while gathering intelligence on Alexander's movements. Her presence in town had raised eyebrows at first, but she'd crafted a careful story about seeking investment opportunities that the Phillips family seemed to accept. Through her network of connections, she'd uncovered more victims, men and women whose deaths had been dismissed as accidents or attributed to the harsh environment. As darkness descended, Ethan noticed Alexander speaking in hushed tones with two rough-looking men near the stables. They weren't locals, likely hired guns brought in from Prescott or Yuma. The marshal recognized the type. Hard men who asked no questions and left no traces. Alexander was preparing for something, and the timing couldn't be coincidental. The following morning brought news that 3 prospectors had filed claims on the northern tract. Ethan recognized one name, Benjamin Walker, an experienced miner who'd worked claims from Flagstaff to Globe. If Alexander followed his pattern, Benjamin would be the first target. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dusty streets of Globe as Marshal Ethan Mitchell crouched behind an overturned wagon, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The air was thick with gun smoke and the metallic tang of blood. Behind him, Deputy Benjamin Turner lay wounded but alive, pressing a blood-soaked bandana against his shoulder. They had finally cornered Alexander Phillips, the mine owner whose web of deception had claimed 12 lives, but the price had been steep. Through the haze, Ethan could make out Phillips barricaded in the assay office, occasionally firing wild shots from a Winchester rifle through the broken windows. The truth about the massive gold deposit hidden deep in the Mountain Queen mine had come at a terrible cost. Helen Roberts, the widow of Phillips' first victim, had been right all along. Her husband Jacob hadn't simply disappeared into the desert after striking it rich. He'd been murdered to keep the secret. The investigation had led Ethan down a twisted path, each clue revealing more of Phillips' elaborate scheme. The mine owner had cultivated a careful image as Globe's leading citizen, hosting lavish parties at his mansion while secretly eliminating any prospector lucky enough to discover traces of the mother lode. Even now, Ethan could hardly believe the respected businessman had murdered a dozen men in cold blood to maintain control of the gold. Frances Turner, Benjamin's wife, had been the one to make the crucial connection. As the town's schoolteacher, she had access to old property records and noticed how Phillips had systematically bought up claims around the Mountain Queen, often just days after their owners vanished. The pattern was clear. Find gold, disappear, Phillips acquires the claim. But proving it had been another matter entirely. The breakthrough came when Noah Perez, an old Mexican prospector, recognized Phillips's distinctive boot prints at one of the murder sites. The same prints had been found at 3 other locations where bodies were discovered. But Phillips had friends in high places, including the territorial judge, and local law enforcement seemed suspiciously uninterested in pursuing the case. That's when Ethan had been called in from Prescott. "You can't hide forever, Phillips," Ethan called out, trying to keep the mine owner talking while Deputy Turner circled around behind the building. "We found the survey maps in your safe. We know about the gold vein running through half the county. Killing those men won't keep it secret anymore." A shot rang out in response, splintering the wagon wheel inches from Ethan's head. Inside the assay office, Phillips was growing desperate. His carefully constructed world was crumbling around him. The territorial governor had already been notified, and news of the massive gold deposit would soon spread across Arizona. The economic shock would be devastating, exactly what Phillips had tried to prevent. But his methods had been unconscionable, and Ethan had sworn to bring him to justice. Clara Phillips, Alexander's wife, had finally broken her silence that morning, unable to live with the guilt any longer. She had witnessed her husband return home covered in blood the night Jacob Roberts disappeared, had helped him burn the clothes. For 3 years she had kept his secret, telling herself it was for the greater good, that controlling the gold would prevent another rush like the one that had nearly torn California apart. The sound of breaking glass drew Ethan's attention to the back of the building. Benjamin Turner had managed to get into position, but Phillips heard him too. The mine owner swung his rifle around just as Benjamin dove through the window. 2 shots rang out almost simultaneously. Ethan vaulted over the wagon and charged through the front door, his Colt drawn and ready. The scene inside the assay office was chaos. Papers and broken glass littered the floor, and the air was thick with dust. Benjamin lay motionless near the window, but Phillips was nowhere in sight. A trail of blood led to a trapdoor in the floor, the entrance to the tunnel system that connected the assay office to the Mountain Queen mine. Phillips was making his last desperate bid for escape. Ethan descended into the darkness, moving cautiously through the narrow passage. The tunnels were a maze, and Phillips knew them well, but the mine owner was wounded now, leaving a clear trail to follow. The sound of labored breathing echoed ahead, growing louder as Ethan drew closer to his quarry. The final confrontation was at hand, deep beneath the streets of Globe. Water dripped from the tunnel ceiling as Ethan rounded a corner and found himself in a large chamber. His lantern light revealed glittering veins of gold in the walls, the mother lode that had driven Phillips to murder. The mine owner stood at the far end, rifle raised, blood seeping from a wound in his side. "You don't understand," Phillips wheezed. "I had to protect the territory. Gold rushes destroy everything they touch. That wasn't your decision to make, Ethan replied, his voice steady despite the tension. Those men had families, lives. Jacob Roberts' daughter Alice will grow up without a father because of you. Phillips's finger tightened on the trigger, but Ethan was faster. The marshal's shot echoed through the chamber, and Alexander Phillips crumpled to the ground, his rifle clattering on the rocky floor. The aftermath was swift and far-reaching. News of the gold vein spread quickly, but the territorial government was prepared this time. Regulations were put in place to prevent the chaos Phillips had feared. Helen Roberts received her husband's claim as compensation, ensuring Alice would have a secure future. And Globe began to heal. The shadow of Alexander Phillips' crimes finally lifted from the desert town. As the dust settled in Globe, Ethan found himself drawn back to the abandoned mine shaft where the final confrontation had taken place. The morning sun cast long shadows through the weathered timber supports, illuminating specks of gold still embedded in the walls. He traced his fingers along the rough stone, understanding now why Phillips had gone to such lengths to keep this secret. The vein wasn't just rich, it was unprecedented in size, stretching deeper into the mountain than anyone had initially realized. In the weeks that followed, Helen Roberts transformed from a grieving widow into a formidable businesswoman. With the help of Benjamin, the town's most experienced prospector, she established a systematic approach to mining the claim. Workers were paid fair wages, safety measures were implemented, and a portion of the profits was set aside for the town's development. Little Alice, now 7, would often sit at the mine's office entrance, drawing pictures of the desert flowers that sprouted after rare rainstorms. The territorial governor himself visited Globe to oversee the new regulations. The town's main street, once a simple dirt road lined with modest wooden buildings, began to show signs of careful planning and prosperity. Francis, the schoolteacher, opened a proper schoolhouse where Alice and other miners' children could learn their letters and numbers. The ghost of violence that had haunted the town began to fade like morning mist in the desert sun. Clara, who ran the general store, expanded her inventory to include mining equipment and basic luxuries that the growing population demanded. She often spoke with Ethan about how the town had changed, remembering the dark days when miners would disappear without trace. Now, the sound of pickaxes and friendly chatter echoed through the canyons, replacing the eerie silence that had once dominated the landscape. Ethan received word from his superiors in Prescott about similar situations developing in other mining towns. The territory was growing faster than anyone had anticipated, and with it came the need for more lawmen. Noah, a young deputy from Flagstaff, arrived seeking Ethan's mentorship. The marshal found himself sharing not just techniques for tracking criminals, but also the harder lessons about justice and mercy that the Phillips case had taught him. The desert itself seemed to respond to the change in Globe's fortunes. After a particularly wet spring, the harsh landscape erupted in a riot of wildflowers. Anna, the local herbalist, who had tended to many of Phillips' victims in their final hours, began teaching others about the healing properties of desert plants. She especially focused on instructing Alice, who showed a natural aptitude for the old knowledge. One evening, as Ethan sat on the porch of the newly built marshal's office, he watched Helen and Alice walking home from the mine. The setting sun painted the desert in shades of gold and purple, reminding him of the precious metal that had caused so much bloodshed. But now, under Helen's careful management, the mine was bringing life instead of death to Globe. The town's children played freely in the streets, no longer afraid of mysterious disappearances. The territorial bank in Globe, managed by Benjamin's son, established a system for miners to deposit their findings safely. This simple change prevented the robberies and murders that had once plagued the gold transport routes between Globe and Yuma. The stagecoach now carried more ordinary passengers than gold shipments, as families began settling in the area, drawn by the promise of stable work and a growing community. Years later, when Alice Roberts came of age, she took her place alongside her mother in managing the mine. The two women became known throughout the territory for their fair business practices and commitment to workers' safety. The massive gold vein that Phillips had killed to keep secret became a source of steady prosperity rather than sudden wealth, its resources carefully extracted and managed for the benefit of all. Ethan remained in Globe, watching it transform from a rough mining camp into a proper town. The desert winds still howled through the canyons at night, but they no longer carried whispers of murder. Instead, they brought the sounds of civilization, the church bell, children's laughter, and the steady rhythm of the mine's operations. The Marshal had seen enough violence to last several lifetimes, but in Globe, he found something he hadn't expected, a place where justice and prosperity could coexist, built on the foundation of hard lessons learned in blood and gold. The final confrontation between Marshal Ethan Mitchell and Alexander Turner unfolded in the deepest chamber of the Globe Mining Company's main shaft. The flickering lamplight cast dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls, glinting off exposed veins of gold that seemed to mock the dead men who'd lost their lives trying to keep this secret. Ethan's boots crunched on loose gravel as he kept his revolver trained on Turner, who stood with his back against the tunnel wall, a maniacal gleam in his eyes. "You don't understand what you're dealing with, Marshal," Turner spat, his once pristine suit now covered in mine dust. "This isn't about a few dead miners. This is about the very future of the Arizona Territory. Do you have any idea what would happen if word got out about this mother lode? The entire economy would collapse overnight." Behind Ethan, Benjamin Roberts and Clara Phillips helped support the injured Noah Perez, who'd taken a bullet in the shoulder during their pursuit of Turner through the maze-like mine passages. The young miner had been essential in leading them to this chamber, having discovered Turner's secret maps just days before becoming his next intended victim. 15 men, Ethan said, his voice echoing off the stone walls. 15 honest workers who just wanted to provide for their families. And you murdered them all because they stumbled across your precious secret. The Marshal's finger tightened on the trigger as Turner's hand inched toward his coat pocket. In the tense silence, water dripped somewhere in the darkness beyond their lamplight. Clara's breath came in short gasps, her hand pressed against Noah's wound to stem the bleeding. The air was thick with the metallic smell of blood mixing with the earthy scent of the mine. "Those men signed contracts," Turner shouted, his composure finally cracking. "Everything they found belonged to the company, belonged to me. They had no right to threaten exposure, no right to demand their fair share of what was rightfully mine." His hand suddenly whipped toward his pocket. The shot echoed deafeningly in the confined space. Turner's derringer clattered to the ground unfired as he clutched his chest, red blossoming across his white shirt. He slumped against the wall, leaving a crimson smear as he slid to the ground. His final words were barely a whisper. "You've doomed us all." In the days that followed, Ethan worked with Frances Turner, Alexander's estranged sister, to implement a carefully planned revelation of the gold discovery. Rather than causing economic collapse, the controlled release of information and measured mining operations brought sustainable prosperity to Globe. The families of Turner's victims received generous compensation from the mine's profits, though nothing could truly make up for their losses. Noah and Clara married in the spring, using their share to start a general store that would serve the growing town for generations to come. Benjamin Roberts took over as mine foreman, instituting fair practices and profit sharing that became a model for other operations throughout the territory. The Globe Mining Company's dark chapter was over, but its legacy would forever be entwined with the story of justice prevailing over greed. Helen Mitchell, Ethan's wife, often said that the real gold discovered in Globe wasn't in the mine at all. It was in the bonds forged between the townspeople who'd faced darkness together and emerged stronger. The Marshal came to agree, though he never forgot the cost of that wisdom. Years later, when asked about the case, Ethan would simply say that every man's true character is revealed not by what he finds, but by what he does with it. The ghost town of Prescott served as a stark reminder of what Globe might have become had greed won the day. Jacob Phillips, the territorial judge who'd helped Ethan build the case against Turner, ensured that the full story was recorded in court documents. Future generations would know how close the territory had come to destruction, and how the courage of a few good people had made all the difference. Anna Roberts, Benjamin's daughter, grew up hearing stories about the year justice came to Globe. She would eventually write a detailed account that became required reading in Arizona schools, ensuring that the lessons learned would never be forgotten. The mine itself continued operating well into the next century, its wealth carefully managed to benefit all of Globe's citizens. The chamber where Turner met his end was sealed off, though some said that on quiet nights, you could still hear echoes of that final confrontation in the deepest tunnels. Marshal Ethan Mitchell served Globe for another 20 years, watching it grow from a rough mining town into a thriving city. But he never again encountered a case that so clearly demonstrated how the worst and best of human nature could be revealed by the glitter of gold. The desert winds still whisper through Globe's streets, carrying tales of the past to new generations. And in the heart of the old mine, behind steel doors and forgotten passages, a mother lode of gold remains, not as a secret to be hoarded, but as a reminder that true wealth lies in the hearts of those who choose justice over greed. Years after the Turner case, Marshal Ethan Mitchell's legacy lived on through his daughter Clara, who had inherited both his sharp mind and unwavering sense of justice. She became Globe's first female deputy, working alongside her aging father as they continued to protect the town that had been forever changed by the events at the mine. The old-timers would often remark how she had her father's eyes, the same ones that had seen through Turner's web of deception all those years ago. Frances, Turner's widow, had transformed the mining company into a model of ethical business practices, working closely with the town council to ensure fair treatment of workers and equitable profit sharing. The dark shadow of her husband's crimes had driven her to create something positive from tragedy, establishing a foundation that provided education and support for miners' families throughout the territory. In the spring of 1899, when Alexander Noah, one of the original survivors of Turner's scheme, passed away, his funeral brought together the remaining witnesses of those fateful events. Helen, now a respected schoolteacher, had documented the full story in a leather-bound journal that became required reading for every new deputy in Globe. The truth of what gold fever could do to a man's soul served as a powerful warning to future generations. The old mining trails that had once led to secret meetings and murderous ambushes were now popular routes for tourists exploring the desert's beauty. Local guide Benjamin Jacob, son of one of Turner's victims, had turned his father's tragic end into a way to honor his memory, sharing the true history of Globe's darkest chapter while leading visitors through the spectacular desert landscape. Anna Mitchell, Ethan's wife, had become the keeper of the town's collective memory, hosting gatherings where the younger generation could learn from those who had lived through the Turner killings. Her garden, blooming improbably in the harsh desert climate, became a symbol of how beauty and growth could emerge from even the most barren circumstances. The mine's entrance had been transformed into a memorial, with the names of Turner's victims carved in stone. Every year on the anniversary of the case's resolution, the townspeople would gather there at sunset, lighting lanterns that cast long shadows across the desert floor. The ceremony served as both remembrance and reminder that the price of gold was never worth a human life. As Globe grew into the new century, the lessons of the Turner case influenced every aspect of its development. The town council, led by descendants of those involved in the original events, established strict regulations for mining operations, ensuring that profit never again took precedence over human lives. The desert winds that once carried secrets now brought whispers of progress and healing. The original courthouse where Turner had been sentenced still stood, though now it housed a museum dedicated to territorial justice. Among its exhibits was Marshal Mitchell's badge, donated by Clara after her father's passing, displayed alongside Helen's detailed account of the investigation. Together, they told a story not just of crime and punishment, but of a community's resilience in the face of betrayal. In the end, the true wealth of Globe proved to be not in its gold deposits, but in the bonds forged between those who had survived its darkest hour. The descendants of both victims and survivors worked side by side, building a future that honored the past while refusing to be defined by it. The desert frontier that had once harbored deadly secrets now stood as a testament to the triumph of justice over greed. And so, the story of Marshal Ethan Mitchell and the Globe mine murders became more than just a tale of crime and punishment. It became the foundation upon which a community built its future. The harsh desert landscape that had witnessed so much tragedy now bloomed with promise, proving that even in the most unforgiving territory, humanity's better nature could prevail. Years after the Globe mine murders, Marshal Ethan Mitchell's legacy lived on through his daughter Helen, who had taken up the mantle of law enforcement in the growing territory. The old courthouse where her father had brought Alexander Blackwood to justice now housed a small museum dedicated to the case, its weathered wooden floors still creaking with the weight of history. Helen often found herself there during quiet afternoons, studying the exhibits with a mix of pride and melancholy. The discovery of Blackwood's hidden ledgers in an abandoned mine shaft had revealed connections to other wealthy prospectors across the territory, including some in Prescott and Flagstaff. These documents, meticulously preserved by Clara, the town archivist, painted a broader picture of corruption that had nearly strangled the region's development. The investigation that followed led to several prominent figures being brought to justice, though none had matched the calculated brutality of Blackwood.